So I think some people don't actually have identities, which sounds mean. I know, right? It sounds like I'm about to start hating, right? Maybe a little bit, right? Not too much though, not too harshly, just spiritually, right? But I am serious. I don't think some people have identities. I think they have aesthetics, and there's a difference because an identity is like, okay, who are you when nobody's looking? What do you believe? What do you actually want? What do you do when there's no proof that you did it? An aesthetic is just what all that would look like if it had better lighting, right? And that's where it gets weird because a lot of people don't seem like they're becoming a person. They seem like they're designing one. Like they went on Pinterest, found a version, found a version of themselves actually and said, "Yeah, I'm going to live over there." Right? Pinterest is dangerous. You go on there for a desk setup and 40 minutes later you're convinced you need more linen pants, right? You need a ceramic lamp maybe. A whole completely different emotional history, right? Like, bro, I just came here for a chair, now I'm doing a whole tour on Pinterest, right? Why am I rethinking my childhood? But that's the thing. Aesthetic coherence feels good when your actual life feels confusing. That's probably the real point. Like if your internal life is chaotic, if you don't know what you're doing, if your relationships are weird, if your room is technically clean, but your mind is looking like a Popeye's kitchen at 11:47 p.m., then having a consistent visual identity gives you something. It gives you a feeling of control. And I'm not even mad at that because sometimes the room is the only thing you can control. You know, your life falling apart, but the bookshelf looks amazing. That's all that matters. And honestly, I respect it, to an extent, obviously, because I've seen people with apartments that look like they understand themselves, and then you talk to them for 12 minutes and you're like, oh, this chair is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Like the room has clarity, the person does not, the individual does not. The lamp knows who it is, right? You don't. And that's tough. And I'm not saying this from above anybody before somebody says, "Oh, so you're above aesthetics?" No, no, I'm not. Right? Don't be weird now. I love aesthetics. I love clothes. I love rooms. I love objects. I'm literally trying to build a world where furniture and manga and artifacts all mean something. So I can't just sit here and act like I'm against visual language. I love that shit. That would be insane, right? But there's a difference between using aesthetics to express something real and using aesthetics to avoid becoming real. That's where I think people get stuck because at first, the aesthetic is just inspiration. You see a room and you're like, I like that. I want that, right? You see a style and you're like, I want to feel like that. You see some soft lighting, some books, some wood furniture, and maybe a little plant that will be dead on by Thursday, probably. And you're like, yeah, that's gotta be me. That's is all me. And maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe that's a version of you trying to come out. But sometimes it's not you. Sometimes it's emotional cosplay, which sounds dramatic, but I stand by it because you can look calm without being calm. You can look deep without being deep. You can look disciplined without being disciplined. You can look healed without being healed. You can look masculine without being grounded, right? You can look creative without making anything, all right? And the internet has made that gap very easy to live inside. That's the part I keep thinking about. Like, okay, take the perfect room thing, right? You ever see somebody whose room looks like a monastery designed by a Scandinavian architect, right? Everything beige, one chair, one blanket, one book open on the table, like they're just casually reading some next to oat milk and latte, right? And then you find out their life is in complete disorder, right? Like emotionally, financially, romantically, spiritually, the whole shebang, all of it, right? But the room is locked in, the room is clean, right? The room got its MBA, right? It's doing well. It's doing well for himself, right? And I think that happens because the room becomes a promise. It's like, if I can make this space look peaceful, maybe I'll become peaceful myself, which honestly is not a crazy thought. The environment does shape you, rooms do teach you behavior. A clean room can pull something out of you, a good desk can make you want to work, a chair can invite a different version of you. But again, this is where I start getting suspicious, right? Because sometimes people don't want that behavior, right? They don't want the behavior. They just want the feeling of being adjacent to the behavior, you know? They want a room of a reader more than the act of reading. They want the wardrobe of a disciplined man more than the daily boredom of discipline. They want the visual language of healing more than the humiliation of actually changing. And I'm sorry, actual change is embarrassing. People don't talk about that enough. Actual change does not look that good at first. It's awkward. It's boring. It's repetitive. It's you messing up the same thing again and then sitting there like, okay, so maybe I'm the problem, right? It's not aesthetic at all. Trust me. That's just a regular Tuesday, Nobody wants to post that, So instead, people build the environment of change, evidence of change, symbols of change, and then they kind of hope that identity catches up, which maybe it does sometimes, I don't know. Like, I don't want to fully hate on it because sometimes you do become the thing you were pretending to be. A person buys a sketchbook made because they want to feel creative. At first, it's just aesthetic for them. Then one day they actually start drawing. Now it's real. A guy buys a book, buys some books because he wants to look thoughtful. At first, it's nasty, right? Like, brother, the bookmark has not moved in 6 months. You LeBron with it, right? That book is decorative, loading like it's just that book is a decorative loading bearing intellectualism, right? But then maybe one day he actually starts reading the book and now it becomes part of him. So I don't think the performance is always fake. Sometimes performance is rehearsal, That's the nuance. And I know nuance is annoying because people want everything to be either fake or real. But I don't think identity works like that. I think sometimes people put you put put on the outside first because the inside doesn't exist yet, which is risky, right? Because if you never do the inner work, now you're just living inside a pretty costume. and the costume starts asking for maintenance. And that's where it gets exhausting because once your identity is mostly aesthetic, you have to keep feeding it, right? You have to keep buying things, you keep posting things, you keep arranging things, keep proving things, right? Keep updating the visual evidence that you're still that kind of person. That's not self-expression anymore. That's rent. You're paying rent to an image of yourself. And some of y'all are behind, eviction notice on that personality, right? That's crazy. But you see it everywhere, like depression aesthetics. That one is fascinating to me, right? That one is fascinating to me, right? Because being depressed is horrible, like genuinely. It's not cute, it's not poetic. It's not always rain on a window and cigarette and a black sweater, right? Sometimes it's not brushing your teeth. Sometimes it's sitting on the edge of your bed for 38 minutes because putting socks on feels like a government project. Sometimes it's laundry becoming architecture, right? That pile got zoning laws now, right? But online, depression has a look. It has a filter, it has a playlist, it has a font, it has an apartment with one mattress on the floor and a blue light leaking through the blinds, right? And again, I get why people romanticize pain. Pain is easier to survive when it feels like it means something, right? That's human. But sometimes I wonder if people are attached to aesthetic of sadness because it gives their confusion a shape. Like if you can make my pain look beautiful, maybe it feels less random. Maybe it feels less humiliating. Maybe it feels like a story instead of a symptom. And stories are powerful. That's why manga hits. That's why films hits. That's why certain characters stay with people because they make suffering feel legible. And real suffering is often not legible. It's just ugly and inconvenient and badly timed. And that's not very Pinterest friendly. So people clean it up. They turn it into something coherent. And coherence feels like identity. That might be the whole thing, right? Aesthetic coherence became emotional compensation. I know that's some, I know that sounds like a sentence somebody will put on a black slide with tiny text and pretend it's profound, right? But I mean this very plainly. People feel scattered, so they make the outside consistent. They don't know what they believe, so they dress like someone who does. They don't know what they want, so they build a mood board that wants things for them. They don't know who they are, so they pick a visual language and try to live inside of it. And I'm not even saying that's dumb. I think it's very understandable. It might even be necessary sometimes. And but then the question becomes, when does self-expression become self-avoidance? Because at some point you have to ask, am I expressing myself or am I hiding inside a version of myself that looks better than I feel? And that question gets quiet fast because I think a lot of people know deep down, they know when the aesthetic is real and when it's a shield, like hyper curated masculinity, right? That one is everywhere right now. Every dude got the same setup, the watch, the gym lighting, the dark room, the black coffee, the quote about discipline, the camera angle looking slightly down like he's being judged by God in a tripod. All right. And look, I'm not against masculinity, I'm not against discipline. I'm not against working out to be like, please work out, right? Drink some water. Please drink water. Please, have a bed frame, right? We need standards here, right? But some of it doesn't feel like masculinity, right? It feels like masculinity themed content, that's different. It's like a manhood man board, or it's like a manhood mood board, right? And the thing about mood boards is they're not bad, they can inspire you, but you cannot live inside one. At some point, you have to stop collecting images of life and start dealing with the boring parts of building it. Because masculinity is not just having a watch and looking tired, looking tired in a parking garage, right? Sometimes masculinity is answering an uncomfortable text, right? Sometimes it's apologizing without doing a speech. Sometimes it's turning every feeling into anger because anger is the only emotion that your outfit supports. That's where it gets funny to me. Some people build an aesthetic so narrow, they don't even have a room to be human inside of it. Like the fit is clean, but emotionally, there's no storage space. Where do you put fear? Where do you put tenderness? Where do you put confusion? You can't, right? It clashes with the palette. So now you're stuck so now you're stuck performing a version of yourself that doesn't have anywhere to put parts of that don't match. And I think women get a version of this too with the soft life thing. And again, I'm not hating, right? Soft life as an idea is beautiful. Rest, ease, beauty, peace. Not having a constantly not having to constantly suffer to prove you deserve good things is valid, very valid. But online, sometimes sometimes soft life turns into another job. Now your rest, now your rest has deliverables. Your needs documentation. Your morning's routine has production value. Your matcha got a call sheet. You're not relaxing, right? You're producing evidence of relaxation, right? And that is insane. That is a dark sentence if you really sit with it. Producing evidence of relaxation. Like, what are we doing? But it makes sense in a world where everything has to be witnessed to feel real. That's the internet. That's the internet sickness, right? Not that people want nice things, not that people care about beauty. Beauty is good. Objects matter. Rooms matter, clothing matters, right? Actually, I actually believe that deeply. A chair can change how you sit with yourself. A room can change what you expect from the day. Clothes can help you enter a version of yourself. But if those things become replacements for inner clarity, then you're in trouble because now the objects is doing identity work it was never built to do. The jacket cannot give you a spine. A chair cannot give you peace. The bookshelf cannot give you depth. It can invite those things, it can support those things, but it cannot become those things for you. And maybe that's why some people keep buying, new clothes, new room setup, new aesthetics, new fragrance, new journal, new desk, new lamp, new era, right? Every 3 weeks, somebody entering a new era. Like, brother, finish the old one. Finish that old era first, right? You still owe that era money. But seriously, like new eras are easy when they're visual. You can change your profile picture, right? You can change your wardrobe, you can change your room, you can change your bio, you can change your playlist. And it feels like transformation. But sometimes it's just costume rotation, nasty work, right? because now instead of becoming somebody, you're just refreshing the exterior, like updating the app without fixing the bug. And the bug is still there, the bug is calling your ex at 1:12 a.m., right? The bug is avoiding hard conversations. The bug is not knowing what you want unless somebody online tells you what kind of person wants it. That's the part people don't want to admit. Sometimes aesthetics protect you from decision making. If you know the aesthetic, you don't have to know yourself. You can just ask, what would this version of me do? Right? What would the soft life version do? Right? What would the masculine version do? What would the clean girl version do? What would the mysterious creative versions do? Right? What would the Pinterest versions do? And now your life is being run by a committee of imaginary selves. No wonder people are tired. There's too many people in a meeting and none of them pay rent. Right? This is why I like Perfect Blue as a reference for this, actually. Not in the obvious way of like, oh, fame is bad. That's too easy. What sticks with me is the horror of being watched into becoming something. The image of the person starts becoming a second person, and eventually the real person has to negotiate with the image. That feels very normal now, right? Not celebrity normal, just regular normal. A regular person can have 800 followers and still feel like they're managing a character because the character has expectations. The character dresses a certain way, posts certain things, has certain opinions, use certain words, like certain objects. After enough time, you don't know if you like the thing or if the character likes the thing, right? That is a miserable little puzzle. Like, imagine not knowing whether you actually enjoy your room or if your room is just good evidence. That's where we are right now. And I don't think the answer is to stop caring about aesthetics. That's not it, right? That would be lazy, and ugly, right? Please care a little, right? Some of y'all need to care a little bit more, honestly. Honestly. Not too much on you though, right? But also, yes, some much on you actually. Aesthetics are not the enemy. Beauty is not the enemy. Style is not the enemy. The problem is when style becomes a hiding place. When the outside becomes so coherent that nobody notices the inside is confused. This includes you. That's the part. Because eventually other people believe the aesthetic. Then you start believing in it too. Everybody agrees you're this kind of person. So now you feel obligated to keep being that kind of person, even if it's too small, even if it's outdated, even if even if it was never fully true. And I think that's why people get stuck. They don't just get stuck in bad habits. They get stuck in images of themselves, the person they created, the person that people liked, the person that made sense online, the person that looked healed, the person that looked disciplined, the person that looked mysterious, the person that looked like they had bad taste or they had taste, right? But taste is not a soul. That's probably the line, right? Taste is not a soul. Taste is beautiful. Taste matters, Taste can point towards something, but it cannot replace the thing. And maybe that's what I've been thinking about. Some people are not expressing who they are, they're decorating the absence of knowing. And I don't mean that cruelly, right? I think we all do it in some way. I think we all use objects and clothes and rooms and symbols to reach toward a version of ourselves we don't fully understand yet. That's human. But at some point, the reaching has to become living. At some point, the room has to become more than a room. The clothes have to become more than a costume. The bookshelf has to become more than a background, you know? The aesthetic has to stop protecting you from the question. And the question is simple. If nobody could see it, would you still choose it? Would you still put it on? Would you still buy it? Would you still call yourself that? Would you still want that room? Would you still want that life? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not, right? But I think that's where identity starts. Not in the image, not in the mood board, not in the feed. Maybe identity starts in the moment where there's no audience left and you still know what still feels true.